Good evening. My name is Doug Townsend. I'm presiding officer of the School of Arts and Sciences. And on behalf of the faculty and staff of the school, I'd like to welcome you tonight to this lecture. The Arts and Sciences Distinguished Lecture Series is one of the many ways that the School of Arts and Sciences supports and encourages the creation and dissemination of knowledge. If you take a moment to look at, sometime this evening, to look at the program, you'll see the list of the names of the 24 previous distinguished lecturers. We have the honor and privilege of adding a 25th name to the list tonight, and that would be the name of Van Coufoudakis. Van has been a faculty member at IPFW for approximately 35 years and is currently the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences. He will receive a more complete and appropriate introduction in just a minute, but before that, I would like to ask Van to come up and accept this plaque commemorating the occasion. Quite a nice plaque, and you might get him to show it to you after the lecture is over. His name will also be inscribed on the plaque that's at the rear of this room that contains the names of all of the distinguished lecturers. And now I'd like to call on Dr. James Lutz, Chair of the Political Science Department, to introduce our speaker tonight. Jim?
I, of course, will keep this brief because you didn't come to hear me talk. It's actually given me a great deal of pleasure to introduce Van. I've only been here for about 20 years, so I've only known him for about 20 years as a junior faculty member and then as a not-so-junior faculty member. And now, actually, his help in the past year as a novice chair has been very helpful as well. His expertise in the area of international relations, particularly in regards to the Eastern Mediterranean, is well known. He has an extensive publication record, which is impressive and sometimes depressing to look at it at times as well, for its length, if nothing else. And in particular, what's impressive, if you look at the things that he has done over the years, is the places that he has been called upon to give talks, and simply the opportunity or the privilege of being requested to give talks at places like the NATO War College and the Foreign Service Institute say a great deal about his expertise and how he is viewed in the world beyond Fort Wayne and even outside this country. I would love to have his frequent flyer miles on the many airlines. He's probably got more in a year than I've had in a career, but I'll try and catch up as time goes by. There's the write-up contains kind of the highlights, the very, very brief highlights of his career, but 70 articles and book chapters, an editor and author of 4 books, and the recipient of the Commander of the Order of Phoenix are just kind of the highlights of a very busy and active career. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Van.
You know, it's nice I'm not going to an airport tonight, because if I appeared at an airport with all the electronic gear on me, they probably would arrest me and send me to some location unknown to my family and unknown to my wife, in the style of how the FBI treats suspects these days. I didn't know what to do about an introduction. I hope you can hear me. I've got 2 mics. Do they work? No? Okay. I was planning to start with music, but then I thought that Victor Borge used to do that along with his lectures. Remember his political commentary, playing music at the same time. I decided not to copy him, so we'll just stick together tonight for a 2-part presentation, basically. One part, the first part, is going to be pretty much on policymaking in Washington and show you a couple of the areas where I have been active and why. And then we'll go from there to a kind of a critique of post-Cold War foreign policy, the actual conduct of American foreign policy, and some thoughts that I have on that particular subject. My work in many ways has been the classic example of how foreign policy expertise and community engagement come together to enhance the kind of learning environment we provide here for our students at IPFW. My own involvement in foreign policy has been I would say, the culmination of 4 experiences. First, the inspiration I have found in Thucydides' The Peloponnesian War, a book that was written about 400 BC. I consider that to be the primer of international politics because it shows that those who fail to understand history are destined to repeat it. Second, the tragedy of Vietnam, a war far from home with undefined and evolving goals and no exit strategy. Third, the CIA involvement in the 1967 military coup in Greece. The Johnson and the Nixon administrations were the only among all Western European governments that supported the suppression of democracy in Greece for 7 long years. And by the way, even though the documents from that period have been declassified on the 30-year rule, the Bush administration refuses to allow the publication of the volume on Greece covering the period from 1965 to 1970. I wonder why. The fourth item that really triggered my interest and my involvement in politics and foreign policy has been the 1974 military coup against the democratically elected government of Cyprus and the support extended by our government to the Turkish invasion and to the continuing occupation of 38% of that island republic. This documented violation of American and international law, of the NATO and the United Nations Charter, and of the European Covenant of Human Rights has yet to be remedied because Washington values more its strategic relationship with Ankara. President Clinton, in his visit to Greece in December 1999, apologized for what he said were mistakes in our policy towards Greece and Cyprus prior to 1974. Well, small comfort to those who suffered and still suffer from the consequences of these actions. Sometimes we wonder why many overseas question America's objectives and actions. The answers are to be found in this type of foreign policy misconduct. In all these events, Henry Kissinger's actions stand out. Without minimizing his contributions to Soviet-American détente, to arms control, and to the rapprochement with China, he is a prime candidate for the International Criminal Court for his actions, especially in Chile, against the Kurds and in Cyprus. I would suggest reading the latest book by Christopher Hitchens, a very well-known British journalist on Henry Kissinger. In addition, Kissinger's own memoirs, both volumes, show his total contempt for the rule of law, for Congress, for human rights, and for any democratic procedure that stood in the way of achieving his grand strategic design. This will be his legacy long after he's gone. Now, with that off my chest, let's get into policy specifics. The basic objective of foreign policy is to advance a nation's security along with other secondary interests in a rapidly changing political, military, and economic environment. It is difficult to separate foreign and domestic policy. For example, post-World War II interdependence shows that environmental issues spill over national boundaries, that organizations like OPEC can affect the economies and the policies of energy-dependent states, and that minor actors like bin Laden can redefine the domestic and foreign policy agenda of even a superpower. Farmers, labor, business, ethnic groups, state and national political leaders, diplomats, military, and other interested parties are all involved in the foreign policy process. Therefore, politics does not anymore stop at the water's edge. The Founding Fathers granted responsibility for foreign policy to the federal government. Under the separation of powers, Congress and the executive share power in foreign and security policy. However, during the Cold War, power shifted to the president, often with the blessing of the federal courts and Congress. In contrast to interpretations of the domestic policy process that view public policy as the outcome of struggles by multitudes of competing groups on the Hill and in the executive branch, the making of foreign policy has often been seen as a rational process because it involves the national interest. Even though this may be true during times of crisis, the myth of the national interest being defined above the political process collapses once we acknowledge the link between domestic and foreign policy and the complexity of the policy-making process in the executive branch and in Congress. The Department of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the National Security Council, the Department of State and its geographic bureaus, the intelligence community, and it is a widespread community, Treasury, Labor, Agriculture, and a multitude of other agencies and their counterpart congressional committees have their own distinct views of the world and compete for the president's ear and for public opinion support. This is why quite often, when battles are lost at a particular policy level, what you get are those wonderful leaks that happen in Washington. Washington is like a sieve. If you just happen to sit underneath the right hole, you're bound to pick up something wonderful. This is why, in the last month, you have heard about the memo, the dissent memo of Secretary of State Powell over the captives in Guantanamo. This is why the other day you found, again out of the hands of the Department of State, the dissenting memo on targeting China, Russia, and a variety of other countries. That's how these things come out in public. These are reasons to cultivate public opinion and bring public opinion reaction. Now, interest groups consisting of ethnic groups, non-governmental organizations, oil companies, arms exporters, labor, agribusiness, and others seek to influence foreign policy. And therefore, the unresolved dilemma is how to provide the president with adequate power to promote and protect the national interest while operating within the boundaries of the democratic process. Now, while the president and his key foreign policy and national security advisors would prefer to define and conduct foreign policy through a small group of experts away from public scrutiny, the democratic process calls for as broad participation as possible among multiple actors from within and outside the federal government. Already you have a little set of circles up there. These circles show you the reality of politics, foreign policy politics in Washington. When peacetime exists, then, of course, there is a fair amount of interplay at all these diverse levels. At the same time, when there is a crisis, the real action is done here at the very center, where the president and his advisors, of course, are located. Otherwise, you have a lot of interplay at all the other levels between the media, the political parties, interest groups, public opinion, the agencies, Congress, and so on down the line. Now, the president has maximum flexibility in crisis situations, which usually involve direct and immediate external threats and require quick and effective responses. These responses are planned and executed by small, cohesive groups of advisors from the president's national security team with very little external interference, let alone consultation. Congress and the public provide legitimacy for these decisions. For example, classic examples would be the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis and the decisions in the aftermath of September 11. Tight groups within the White House define policy, execute it, and then Congress says, right, Mr. President, keep doing what you're doing. However, most foreign and national security policy decisions involve routine bureaucratic policies formulated over a long period of time, primarily in the executive branch. Such policies allow for maximum participation by various actors, including executive agencies, and you see them up here, congressional committees, and of course, a variety of interest groups, each of which, as I said before, has different perceptions of what the national interest is and how it is to be attained. The president involves himself only in areas that he determines to be important. Now, during the first 2 decades of the Cold War, bipartisanship defined congressional executive relations in foreign and security policy. Vietnam, however, changed all this. Congressional assertiveness became the rule because pressure came from public opinion, and the feeling existed that the executive had misled and misinformed Congress and the public, a view that, of course, was enhanced later on by the revelations of the Iran-Contra scandal during the Reagan administration. Crisis and bureaucratic decisions, however, are not mutually exclusive. Routine management of foreign policy issues can lead to crisis, and when crises subside, the policy issues become once more matters of bureaucratic handling. For example, the problem of Cuba was handled primarily at the bureaucratic level until the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in October of '62. In the years since the crisis subsided, Cuban policy returned again to the level of bureaucratic handling. Afghanistan had been primarily a bureaucratic problem until September 11. Now, assuming success in meeting the goals we have set in this crisis, policy towards Afghanistan will also return to the bureaucratic level sometime in the future. Now, foreign policy interest groups are very much part of the bureaucratic process, and this has been the primary area of my own involvement. And you see the outer area here, it says interest groups. At the same time, my adventures in Washington have taken me in a variety of places, including the senior foreign policy departments like CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, related groups of this type, and of course, well into the congressional circle, the congressional committee circle, particularly those on foreign and military policy, and on occasions into this inner circle of presidential advisors, including the briefing I did once upon a time to the Clinton transition team when President Clinton had Governor Clinton won the first election. Now, what is there that contributes to the participation of interest groups in the foreign policy process? I'll give you at least 5 or 6 reasons, 6 reasons. One, the diffusion of power in Washington, which provides many entry points in the policy process. You can look at those circles and you can see departments, you can see congressional committees, you can see the Congress itself and so on. Now, each of those points of entry has a distinct view of what should be done in a particular issue. Second, the political needs of policymakers. Candidates for Congress and for the presidency seek support of influential voting blocs. Armenian Americans in California, Jewish Americans and Greek Americans in key states like California, New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Florida, Illinois, to just name a few. Hispanic voters in the Southwest and in Florida. Third, the fact that normally foreign policy is not a public priority, and most members of Congress have limited, if any, expertise and interest in foreign affairs. I can tell you some wonderful stories here. Therefore, foreign policy interest groups can exert much greater influence than their numbers would ever indicate. 4, foreign policy lobbies are most effective when their objectives parallel those of governmental policy. Classic examples, the China lobby from 1949 to the mid-70s, and the case of the American Jewish community in Middle East policy. 5, when foreign policy lobbies work as coalitions rather than solo. The imposition of the congressional arms embargo on Turkey from 1974 to 1978 because of Turkey's invasion of Cyprus came against fierce opposition by the Ford administration. Even though Greek Americans were the catalysts in this process, we were joined by a variety of other groups. We put together a very dynamic coalition that included congressman advocating the rule of law in American foreign policy in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, Armenian Americans who had been the victims of Turkey's genocide, African American congressmen from urban areas critical of Turkey's role in the drug traffic, and drugs in the inner city are a major problem, and Jewish Americans who normally do not support actions against Turkey, who took it after Henry Kissinger in the fall of 1974, because that was the time when Henry Kissinger was putting the pressure on the Israelis to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. So to pay him back, they supported actions against him. And 6, when foreign policy lobbies stay clear of lobbyists hired by foreign governments in the United States. This is imperative in order to avoid accusations of dual loyalty or of working on behalf of a foreign government. But the influence of foreign policy lobbies can be limited also by a number of factors, and I have experienced all of them. 1, the ability of the executive branch to argue that it is acting on behalf of the national interest, while foreign policy lobbies promote only parochial interests. Kissinger, for example, attempted to delegitimize the critics of his actions in Cyprus by identifying us as the Greek lobby, even though all of us were Americans, and there were not only just Greek Americans, as I talked to you about, Greek Americans. Automatically, it was different because Greeks were Greeks, but the American national interest is something different that he was protecting. Second, the presence of countervailing forces in Washington's decentralized policymaking structure. Success at one level can easily be negated by actions at another level. The successful imposition of the congressional arms embargo on Turkey in 1974 was almost completely undermined by the administration's ability to continue to supply arms to Turkey through NATO and Saudi Arabia. Third, the difficulty of keeping coalitions together and publics mobilized over extended periods of time, especially if there is no evidence of policy success. 4, when actions of government abroad contradict objectives pursued by foreign policy lobbies in Washington. Classic examples would be the case of the Netanyahu and the Sharon governments in Israel, or the perception among Greek Americans that among Greek political elites there are anti-American political feelings. 5, the ability of the executive branch to prevail regardless of political cost. The Nixon, Ford, Carter administrations succeeded in changing American policy towards China despite the objections of the once powerful China lobby. The Carter administration lifted the arms embargo on Turkey by 1978 with a very slim margin, thanks to promises of new presidential initiatives to resolve the Cyprus problem and appeals to regional American security interests. So let me close this first part of my presentation with 5 brief conclusions. 1, the criticism frequently heard from the executive branch about the negative role of foreign policy lobbies involves cases where foreign policy lobbies opposed government policy. However, the president and the executive agencies have no difficulty to use foreign policy lobbies to legitimize their policy. For example, President Truman had no difficulty relying on Greek American support on behalf of the Truman Doctrine in 1947. The Nixon administration rationalized its ties to the Greek junta by the fact that it had the support of a largely conservative Greek American community. Second, our political process often leads to cynicism on the part of the public and to confusion and frustration abroad. Public cynicism increases with unfulfilled electoral promises or by meaningless symbolic acts on the part of the president. Governor Carter, during the 1976 presidential campaign, supported the arms embargo on Turkey in return for Greek American votes and contributions. He was also the one that lifted the embargo 2 years later. Carter's promise of active White House involvement in the search for a solution of the Cyprus problem has yet to be fulfilled. The Turkish occupation of Cyprus, happily for the Turks, continues after 28 years. So I have also found it exceedingly difficult to explain the American foreign policy process to even Western European democratic audiences. They find difficult to understand the complexity of bureaucratic decision-making. They wonder as to who speaks for the United States and ultimately what American foreign policy actually is. This becomes even more difficult in the Middle East, where America's Middle East policy is perceived to be the single-handed outcome of the American Jewish community, and in Turkey, where the problems in Turkish-American relations are always attributed to Greek influence, Greek-American influence. Third point, in my travels abroad and in my involvement in Washington, I have witnessed how the contradictions between the promise and the performance of our policy undermines the credibility of this policy. We speak of democracy and human rights, only to forget both in the case of Turkey because of the importance of our military bases there. Up to 1997, the Department of State classified the Albanian UÇK movement, the National Liberation Army, as narco-terrorists. Read the State Department reports on that subject. By 1999, they had changed names. They became freedom fighters. We armed them, trained them, and financed them because we wanted them to fight Milosevic in Kosovo. 4, I have been amazed by the arrogance of power in Washington and the lack of foreign policy planning. I have pointed many times to problems arising from our policies in Southeastern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. The answer seems to be, and I quote, "Don't worry, we will manage." Managing is no substitute for a coherent policy and a policy that reflects American values and long-term interests. And 5, I have witnessed firsthand the manipulation of domestic and foreign public opinion by Washington spin doctors who attempt to justify policies contradicting our laws, values, and traditions. The emergence of a new Pentagonese dialect with its Orwellian vocabulary is a phenomenon that came with Vietnam. That's where we hear now terms like the unlawful combatants in Guantanamo base, collateral damage for the civilian casualties in Kosovo and other places. Those of you that read Orwell's 1984 remember the Ministry of Truth had the slogan, "War is peace." Well, I'm reminded, though, of M.J. Finley's commentary on the Peloponnesian War. He notes that for Thucydides, the correct use of language was a moral question, and its debasement was a symptom of a moral breakdown. Now, our particular tradition, values, and position in the world place us under a microscope all the time. In an age of instant communication, foreign audiences are quick to note contradictions and to raise questions about the motives and the use of American power. As we and the international community come to terms with the consequences of September 11, questions about the objectives and the conduct of American policy are likely to increase. Attempting to silence critics and their questions and to evade their questions as un-American will only raise even greater doubts about our policy objectives. Thus, the central question of foreign policy decision-making remains. In an interdependent democratic environment, how much participation and by which groups are we willing to tolerate and yet protect our values and our own policy interests? Now, we spoke about policymaking. Let's talk a little bit about conduct of foreign policy in the post-Cold War period. We're talking about 1990 and beyond. The collapse of the Soviet Union ushered in the new world order, as the elder President Bush used to say, which consisted of a unipolar system with unchallenged American supremacy in the political, security, and economic arenas. However, in the absence of the Soviet threat, the United States found it difficult to define its national interest. Democratization, economic liberalization, political reform, and the rule of law became appealing policy themes. However, they failed to capture the imagination of the American public or to become the foundations of a new American foreign policy. The decline of the Soviet threat and the threat of nuclear war encouraged the United States to reduce military spending and overseas commitments, while the American public turned even more inward than in the past. It also brought a reevaluation of the role and the mission of the American armed forces, which are recovering from the impact of Vietnam. In addition to a level of forces designed to keep global peace and stability through deterrence and power projection, the American armed forces were expected to deal with threats, emerging threats from the so-called rogue states like Iraq, North Korea, and Iran, states that possessed or sought to develop weapons of mass destruction. The so-called rogue states were also accused of supporting terrorism. The revival of nationalism in the Balkans and the breakup of multi-ethnic states created a new source of instability in the international system. Selective humanitarian interventions provided a new policy challenge for the United States and NATO. The lessons of Vietnam, however, guided the role and the mission of American forces in the post-Cold War era. Limited engagements, the application of high technology on the battlefield, short duration of operations, minimal American casualties became the basic guidelines of engagement. The Gulf War was a classic example of this new outlook. However, new peacekeeping involvements, especially those in the Balkans, lacked an exit strategy, while their political goals evolved with each crisis. In Europe, despite NATO's new charter, Washington continued to complain that the Europeans did not carry their security burden. Washington encouraged the development of a European defense identity as long as it was expressed through NATO and we were able to control its actions through NATO. American relations with Russia and China also underwent a change as Washington sought a new comprehensive relationship with each of them. While welcoming liberalization and economic change in Russia, Washington was troubled by the slow pace of reform, by the high level of corruption, and by Russia's independent actions in the area of weapons and high military technology transfers to states like Iran, Iraq, and so forth, Russia's behavior in Kosovo, Iran, and Iraq, and its unwillingness to adopt the American nuclear agenda, getting rid of the ABM treaty. By the end of the Clinton presidency, Russian fatigue was evident in Washington. While Clinton believed that by embracing the Russian reformers, progress could be made in bilateral relations, George W. Bush called for a more cautious and hardline approach to Moscow. However, both Clinton and Bush, the younger, agreed that the greater threat to the United States was Russia's weakness rather than its strength, and that Russia was not a strategic partner. This is why Russia was excluded from NATO's expansion, while the alliance expanded to Russia's doorstep. Similar was the situation with China. While behaving cautiously at the international level, China acted like a regional superpower. Even though Democrats and Republicans disagreed on the means by which Washington could influence progress in human rights and political liberalization, the consensus was that China was neither a strategic partner nor a status quo power, given the issues like Taiwan, the status of the South China Sea, and weapons and high technology transfers to states like Iran and Pakistan. Finally, in the post-Cold War decade, Washington enforced the double containment policy against Iran and Iraq. I'll be happy to explain that if you like later on. The policy has been questioned by most European states. With British support and occasional participation, we still bomb and isolate Iraq because we have no other policy to deal with Iraq. Looking back then at the first decade of the post-Cold War era, one can safely conclude that this was a period of transition for American foreign policy. The harsh Cold War rhetoric declined, the imminent threat of nuclear war dissipated, but American policy never acquired an overarching, consistent policy theme. Thus, we moved from problem to problem. Now, the events of September 11, however, and the American retaliatory response generated instant assessments in the press, in the media in general, that we had entered a new era of international politics. So the war on terrorism has now become Washington's latest foreign policy theme and foreign policy priority. In the American presidential elections, foreign policy did not play a significant role. However, international events did not wait for George Bush to organize a new foreign and security policy team or to define a new framework for American policy. Early on, he faced the Russian spy scandal, the Sharon election and the collapse of the Middle East peace process, and the spy plane incident with China. The events of September 11 proved that even a superpower is not in control of the international agenda, and that an asymmetrical threat from a minor actor like bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network can rewrite the foreign, the security, and the economic policy agenda of even a superpower. What has changed as a result of September 11 is the feeling of vulnerability by the American public. An overly apathetic public has suddenly become sensitized to the global threat of terrorism, which became the unanticipated focus of American foreign policy. And I want to emphasize the word unanticipated. President Bush's mobilizational rhetoric has relied on metaphors of a protracted war, more like the Cold War, on a potentially costly war in human and material terms, unlike Kosovo and the Desert Storm, and on a just war to destroy bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network. Another unifying theme was that the September 11 events were an act of war. This is why NATO activated Article 5 of the Charter for the first time in its 52-year history, and this strengthened the global aspect of the new struggle, which relied on a coalition of allied states. Political analysts spoke of the Bush Dogma in this war against terrorism. The dogma was, you are with us or against us. But this was nothing new. John Foster Dulles, those of you who are old enough like I am, remember in 1955 had exactly the same words when India, Yugoslavia, and some other states formed the so-called Third World Movement, the non-aligned movement, and his answer was, there is no third way. You're with us or you are against us. So poor George, he's not really that innovative in his thinking. So far, Washington, of course, his advisors date to that period of time anyway. You know. So far, Washington's mobilizational rhetoric appears to be holding as the war against terrorism is carefully presented by the media that have become partners in the war effort. In the absence of significant American battlefield casualties and a public on edge because of rumored and actual terrorist threats against the United States, President Bush's policies continue to enjoy public opinion support. How long this support lasts depends on the outcome of the struggle in Afghanistan in the post-Taliban, post-Bin Laden period, and on the possible expansion of the war to other countries. The American response to September 11 events, of course, had other links to the past. During the Gulf War, the president's father also relied on a coalition to reduce the charge of American unilateral action against an Arab state. Coalition building helped clarify that the war against terrorism was not a Huntingtonian clash of civilizations, nor was it directed against Arabs or Islam. Even though coalition partners, most of them, served nominal, symbolic, or purely logistical functions, their participation legitimized Washington's global war against a global threat that claimed victims from 80 countries in the World Trade Center. However, coalitions are not cost-free. Unholy alliances limit American options. Even before the September 11 events, Prince Abdulaziz Al Saud of Saudi Arabia, in a letter to Secretary Powell, warned the United States about the consequences of its ties to Israel on American-Saudi relations and on the long-term military cooperation between the two countries. Coalitions involve compromises on human rights. Weeks after the September 11 events, President and Mrs. Bush spoke about the violations of women's rights in Afghanistan. But in a classic case of amnesia, they both forgot the deplorable state of women's rights in Afghanistan prior to September 11 and have said absolutely nothing about the identical violations of women's rights in Saudi Arabia. Take a look and read the State Department's report on human rights practices that came out in February. Read the chapter on human rights of women in Saudi Arabia. Compare it with things that you have heard about Afghanistan, and tell me, why do Afghani women count more than the Saudi women who live under exactly the same threat that the Afghani women lived under the Taliban? But again, we have a strategic relationship there, and we don't talk about that. Now, violations, as I said, are fully documented, not only by other human rights organizations, but even by the Department of State. Coalition partners also, like Turkey, Egypt, Russia, China, used September 11 to deflect international criticism of their human rights abuses on the grounds of fighting terrorism. This was the case of Turkey and the Kurds, Egypt and the Islamic and other opposition to the autocratic rule of President Mubarak, Russia and the Chechens, and China against its own Muslim minority. Finally, coalition partners have their own agendas that often differ from that of Washington. The classic case is that of Pakistan. Tom Friedman perceptively concluded that while the United States is fighting bin Laden in Afghanistan via Pakistan, the Pakistanis are fighting India via Afghanistan and the United States. Pakistan, for more than 20 years, has worked hard to build up a hardcore Islamic presence in Afghanistan and to gain strategic depth against India. Further, Pakistan's dictatorship has been legitimized by Washington's policies, has gained the lifting of the sanctions against it, and has been granted $1 billion for its cooperation. That's how those coalitions are built. Looking then at the evolution of American policies since September 11, I can also identify three other elements of continuity. First, Washington has made many compromises to gain short-term coalition support. There is no apparent concern about future consequences. This is the phenomenon we call blowback, and this is not new. We supported Saddam Hussein against Iran. We used the narco-terrorists of the UCK Albanian movement to topple Milosevic. We trained the Taliban and the other Afghan tribes to fight the Russians. The separate agendas of each of these groups and individuals have now come back to haunt us in all these areas. Second, the demonizing in American foreign policy. Bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network definitely threaten American interests. Bin Laden has now joined a long line of demons which has included Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, the Ayatollah, Noriega, and Milosevic, to just name a few. However, demons do not operate in a vacuum. Eliminating these individuals and their organizations without addressing the causes that have created them will not solve the problem of terrorism. Third, national emergencies have caused violations of civil liberties at home. Under the impact of terrorism and public opinion support, Congress has adopted anti-terrorist legislation, granting the president extensive authority. The president has widely interpreted that authority in a way that will come to regret later on. The precedents of World War I, World War II, and the communist scare of the early Cold War period are purely instructive examples. So where do we go from here? I have argued that there is inadequate evidence to suggest that the events of September 11 have ushered in a new era of international politics. What we do have, however, is a clear case of a sudden change in the policy priorities of our country. Thus, the war on terrorism is an evolving policy with no clear direction and whose ultimate objective has yet to be defined beyond those sweeping and dangerous generalizations that have been used recently by Washington insiders. The President, in his State of the Union address on January 29, 2002, spoke of an axis of evil involving Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. It appears that for the time, the hardliners are carrying the day, and that moderates like Secretary of State Powell may have been sidelined. The events of September 11 forced Washington and the American public to re-examine what Stephen Walt describes as the post-Cold War hubris of, quote, dominance without cost. The success of Phase 1 of the war in Afghanistan, at the minimal loss of American lives, along with continuous leaks about new terrorist threats against the United States, has given the President unprecedented levels of public opinion support, despite the recession, the Enron scandal, and the return of budgetary deficits. 4 points are likely to affect future American policy. First, we need to consider not only the outcome of American policy in the war of Afghanistan, but even more importantly, whether Washington and its coalition partners can agree on how to address all forms of terrorism as well as the causes of terrorism. Second, the situation in Afghanistan in the post-Taliban era. Will it result in a new civil war? Will it result in the partition of Afghanistan? Is there an exit strategy for the United States and its coalition partners? What will be the impact of some of these scenarios on neighboring countries, and particularly Pakistan, which today is a volcano waiting to explode? Third, will the American public continue its support of the President's policies if the war on terrorism expands beyond Afghanistan? Will the coalition partners accept to expand this war? And fourth, what will be the impact of this newly found cooperation on the long-term relations of the United States with China and Russia? Terrorism may prove to be only a temporary and superficial foundation on which to build long-term cooperation in view of the issues confronting American relations with Russia and China. Washington has also come under increasing scrutiny and criticism by human rights organizations and even its own allies over the treatment and the classification of captives currently incarcerated in the Guantanamo base in Cuba, an issue that appears to have divided even the administration itself. Washington continues to praise the support it has received from coalition partners, but this is an exaggeration of how widespread coalition support actually is. Earlier, I argued that each of the allies has their own motives for the support or even the muted criticism they may have extended to the United States. Some of this support may anticipate forms of material gain and political support, and may even reflect the need to be on Washington's good side at this point. Over the long term, however, will Russia and China tolerate a permanent American military presence in Central Asia? Will the Europeans support the expansion of the war in North Korea and Iran? I seriously doubt it. Increasingly, European allies have been voicing concern and criticism of Washington's unilateral policies, because the grievance list they have is a fairly lengthy one. It includes pressures for NATO expansion, the exclusion of Russia, the bombing of Kosovo, the ABM treaty cancellation, and on and on. Others are linking American policies in Afghanistan and Central Asia to a strategic power grab in Central Asia of epic proportions, motivated primarily by Caspian oil and gas needs and interests. Consequently, Washington should not expect that the open-ended support it has received until now from NATO allies and coalition partners will last. The real test will be how Washington translates into policy the President's State of the Union rhetorical pyrotechnics about Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. Support for the war on terrorism does not translate to a blank check to settle American grievances elsewhere. Washington and its European allies already disagree on the double containment policy against Iran and Iraq. These disagreements are likely to grow if Iran and Iraq become convenient targets, even though their actions cannot be related directly to the war on terrorism. To paraphrase Stephen Mufson, in a dichotomous world of good or evil, the war on terrorism has now become a morality play in which civilian casualties, the treatment of prisoners, and alliances with repressive regimes become the necessary byproduct of a moral mission. Thus, the events of September 11 brought us into uncharted waters with unclear and shifting goals. However, vulnerability is neither a substantive nor a coherent theme for a new American foreign policy, nor is it a unifying theme on which to base long-term cooperation among diverse societies. Without underestimating the threat of terrorism, American foreign policy remains in a transition, still looking for a unifying theme a decade after the end of the Cold War. You, as citizens and voters, must be part of the discussion on the future of American foreign policy. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions. I'll be happy to take questions that you may have. Comments, questions?
Could you tell us how you really feel about Henry Kissinger?
As I said, I admire him for some things that he did, but there's a place where he should not. When he travels abroad, you know, he should be very careful where he travels. The Pinochet precedent should be very much in the back of his mind. And I say that in good conscience. Chile, he knew what was going to happen. The CIA knew what was going to happen. Did we ever say anything to the recognized government of Chile that they were going to be overthrown in a military coup that cost the lives of thousands of people, let alone the president, the elected president of Chile? No. He says, we decided not to act. Action is as much a decision in foreign policy as a decision not to act. And by not acting, he has the blood of thousands of Chileans in his hands. I can go on with the 1,600 missing in Cyprus, 28 years. The International Red Cross, I have a copy of the International Red Cross report with pictures of people that were seen in captivity by the Red Cross in the hands of Turkey. 1,600 of them. They have yet to be returned. Nobody knows what has happened to them. Kissinger knew about the invasion, both the first phase of the Turkish invasion in July of '74 and the second phase in August of '74. Did he do anything about it? No. He allowed things to happen. Could he have done something about it? Yes, he could. Lyndon Johnson in 1964, when Turkey threatened to invade Cyprus again that summer, you know what he did? He sent Prime Minister İnönü of Turkey an ultimatum. The Turks are still steaming about it. He told them that if you try to land on Cyprus, you are on your own, and NATO will not protect you, and if the Russians come after you, it's your problem. Did the Turks land in Cyprus in 1964? No. So there are things that can be done to control actions of this type. Yes?
You painted a confused picture of American foreign policy over decades. And it's really not just Kissinger. There was Brzezinski and you know, goading the Soviets into war in Afghanistan prior to Reagan years. Can you comment on what you think the underlying problem is, or I mean, because it goes across administrations.
Oh yeah, it goes across administrations.
The moral ambiguity of foreign policy is
that's where I think the dilemma continues to exist between what our values are and what the so-called pragmatic policies require of us to do. And it's usually the so-called pragmatism that takes over and our own values and traditions are sidelined. So we still talk about democracy and human rights and cultural rights and diversity. Well, you know, I'll give you an example again. Take the case of the Kurds. This is one of the most tormented nations in the world. They have been victims of Kissinger twice. But be that as it may, today we have the Kurds in Iraq. We're protecting them with a no-fly zone, and we have threatened a new war on Iraq if Saddam Hussein attempts to enter the Kurdish areas in the northwest of Iraq. In Turkey, they have the identical problem because the Kurds are asking for cultural rights, the right to use their language, to publish their newspapers, to play their music and things like that, things that we take here for granted as part of the democratic procedure. They have used violence against their host government, much like they did in Iraq. Kurds of Iraq we call terrorists. The Kurds of the Kurds of Turkey we call terrorists. The Kurds of Iraq we call freedom fighters. Now, how can you have it both ways? And we have given the Turkish government the intelligence, the weapons to go after, to destroy them. But there is a different relationship between us and Iraq and us and the Turkish government. In the southeast and the Kurdish areas, we have some of our biggest military facilities that we use to launch attacks against neighboring states and things like that. In Incirlik and a variety, Diyarbakir, Incirlik, and places like that. Yes?
To what extent is the foreign policy mess a product of the fact that there's a turnover of power in Washington? Every 4 years as a president, every 2 years in the House of Representatives. In other words, nobody has any interest in long-term foreign policy. You're interested in making sure everything's working while you're in power.
Part of it is indeed true. There is turnover. And remember, foreign policy is not a priority. Priority happens to be during the Vietnam War, but most of the time, foreign policy is not at the top of any government's agenda, be they Republican or Democratic or whatever. But don't forget that the foreign policy bureaucracies that handle day-to-day policy, these are all civil service. They stay. The heads of the departments may change, but the bureaucracy itself stays in place. It's a bureaucratic culture, however, that does not encourage dissenting views or views that are distinctly different from either those of the administration, meaning the White House, or the kind of line that seems to dominate the thinking in defense or state. For example, the whole issue of strategy and so forth. So a new junior officer goes to FSI, the Foreign Service Institute, takes a 6-month country training program, and what does he or she learn? Well, basics about the politics, say, of Italy. Then he or she moves to the Italian desk. Well, what do they read? The files left behind by their predecessors about who the Italian political leaders happen to be, what are their weaknesses, what are their strengths, what are their processes. So it's a self-perpetuating process. And what has amazed me, because I had the pleasure of reading a variety of files pertaining to Southeastern Europe over the years, is the continuity in the thinking from administration to administration, from Secretary of State to Secretary of State, on the simple issues of the day-to-day perceptions about Greeks, about Italians, about Turks. And not that we are at fault only because, of course, perceptions are created by a variety of factors, including how the others act outside our boundaries. But the point is, it's interesting to read those files. Here in the library, you have the FRUS series, the Foreign Relations of the United States series, the declassified documents that cover different geographic areas. They go back to 30 years, they get declassified, they get printed. It's amazing to go and read those things and read the thinking and the assessments that have been done over the years and some continuous threats there. Yes?
My question relates exactly to that. How much of a threat do you feel it is, the incredible move toward reclassifying old federal documents? We're being
Yes.
asked in the library to remove things from our shelves.
Yes,
now.
this is the latest twist. This is why I spoke about the impact on freedoms and civil rights here in this country as a result of the war on terrorism. The Freedom of Information Act, for all practical purposes, has been basically taken apart. If you try to go today to a federal agency to ask any document under the Freedom of Information Act, one, chances are you'll be investigated, and two, chances are they'll delay, even if they give you the document, they'll delay it so long that it'll be useless by the time you get it. This is real now, and indeed, exactly the directives about what should not be on the library shelves anymore, this is new. It happened again as a result of September 11. We took pride in the fact that after 30 years, our archives are basically open.
Has it happened before, or is this unprecedented, do you think?
I would say definitely during the Cold War, the early days of the Cold War, probably 47 to the mid-50s, especially McCarthy era, and so on. But at the same time, remember, the Freedom of Information Act is a post-Vietnam legislative act. And it had worked. I mean, a lot of stuff had come out as a result of the Freedom of Information Act. Today, that act has basically been taken apart. Yes?
Two Hoosiers in the past, two Hoosier politicians, have been identified in the press as being important foreign policy contributors, Lee Hamilton and Senator Richard Lugar currently. What is the impact of a Lee Hamilton out of office and a Richard Lugar in office on foreign policy?
Again, this will probably be taken as a partisan commentary. Dick Lugar came pretty much as the shining star, the young star of the Republican Party when he first entered senatorial politics. He brought in some fresh ideas in a variety of areas. Unfortunately, even though he has some degree of expertise in weapons and things like that, he has not really taken much leadership in that area. He has allowed the foreign policy departments to dominate the agenda. I have great respect for Lee Hamilton. Lee Hamilton was a major voice and still remains a major voice in Washington. Again, this time, of course, he happens to be probably along the personal diplomacy, public opinion, interest groups, and of course with the ties that he has in Washington, D.C., because he's the head of the Wilson Center now. He has done a great deal to quietly provide a voice of moderation, a voice of wisdom in foreign affairs. I have great respect for him. And in my case, back in the 70s when we were fighting the Turkish invasion of Cyprus, he was with us all the way, which raised his stature even more. So, yes, anything else? Yes, Luke.
What's your take on the administration's recent apparent revised policy on the use of nuclear weapons in some future conflict?
I'm not surprised, given that you have in the Defense Department people like Cheney, Wolfowitz, and some of the remnants of the 1960s, the worst days of the 1960s. The question is, why now? And why now, and why those 5 countries in particular? Because, yes, I made a commentary on Russian-American, Chinese-American issues and relations. But at least in the end of the Cold War, in the aftermath of the Cold War, we spoke of the fact that there's a new relationship between us. We're not targeting each other anymore. They were not targeting us. We're not targeting them. And there are means by which you can measure that kind of activity. Whether it is intended on the part of the administration to scare them into submission, to behave themselves, I don't know. I wish I knew. Chances are, however, that that report leaked out on purpose, and chances are it leaked out of Powell's office. And the reason for that is that whatever debates they have had in the executive branch over the direction of American security policy, he lost. And the way to diffuse this is to get the public to know what kind of discussions are going on. And I think this is exactly what happened. But to talk about nuclear weapons to be used possibly against Iran, against Iraq, against North Korea, it's insane. I know that every government, particularly every superpower, they go through all the strategic games. You know, the military like to play those games. They have all those scenarios and things like that. So I'm sure some scenario at some level of the Defense Department has been looking at all these possibilities. But to present it, though, as a presidential directive, and to talk about the possibility of using nuclear weapons against a country like Iran, this is insanity at its finest, because on top of it, here we have been talking to the Iranians quietly over the last probably 5 years, because there is a rise of moderates in Iran today. How can these moderates continue opening the door to Washington when we talk about nuking them in case they misbehave? I mean, It's absolutely irrational. What makes it even more interesting is that Cheney himself, when he was chairman of the Halliburton board, the oil consortium that does the Caspian Sea exploration, he was lobbying on behalf of lifting the sanctions on Iran because it's a lot cheaper to transport oil and gas through Iran instead of building that monster $5 billion pipeline through Turkey. And now he has moved in another location and he advocates, basically he and Rumsfeld and company are advocating the possibility of nuking Iran. It's insanity, I'm sorry. Yes?
I don't feel the purpose, I think, of the developing and letting that leak out. Let me back up. In the last Sunday in the Tim Russert interview, did you happen to see that with Ivanov, the defense secretary for Russia? Russert asked him pointedly what this meant to him, to the Russian government. How did they take it? He brushed it off and asked something that all powers do this. Everybody, Mexico, for instance, when they have their war colleges, it's to stop an invasion from the United States. I mean, every nation has its contingent plans.
Yes.
I think the idea mainly was the idea of the nuclear bomb was directed more to Iraq than in anybody else. The Iraqis or Saddam Hussein has been building these underground palaces, which could be where maybe some of the chemical and biological weapons are being developed way down deep. And this is, I think, was more, you let some of this stuff go and then we're going to nuke you by penetrating your things. And I think we're maybe making a big to-do over that, with the exception of Iraq.
Okay.
Iran is different. Iran, I think, was direct. If Iran launches a missile against somebody, then, and I don't think Iran's about ready to do that.
Well, as I said even in my comment just before, there's no doubt that among military, there are all the scenarios, war scenarios being built. What would you do if? But there is a difference between a scenario that is being discussed within, say, an office in the Defense Department and a presidential targeting directive identifying 5 countries as potential nuclear targets. Second, I agree with you that if indeed Iraq is the primary threat, or at least we're trying to build Iraq as the primary threat for a variety of reasons, then why include the others in that discussion? Because even though Ivanov, for a variety of diplomatic reasons, had to wave it off, he was not going to declare war on the United States on American TV or anything like that, why include this kind of commentary with countries that we say we need to develop consensus, we need to develop common policies to deal with a lot of the common issues that we're faced with? If I was sitting in Moscow, if I was sitting in Beijing, I wouldn't feel very comfortable having a presidential targeting directive that points to me as a potential victim of nuclear attack. So I think it has to be a very careful way of how we identify these things. And on top of it, if we want to deal with countries like Iran, Iraq, North Korea, or whatever, nuclear weapons is just like trying to kill a mosquito with a nuclear weapon. There are other ways of dealing with countries that misbehave, and threatening nuclear weapons in this day and age is counterproductive, and I hope that this administration is going to think twice about it. Now the damage control is being done by Colin Powell, who is trying to say that really we never meant to threaten anyone. We just talked about if something happens, what could happen. And he's trying to poo-poo the whole thing. Yes?
just reflecting on your chart up here, you don't.
It's not mine, Roger Hill's
Okay.
from way back. It shows my age, 1967, but that little set of circles is as good today as it was back then.
But it misses, I think, one significant influencing group, and that's the commercial interests, the military-industrial complex,
Yes,
if you
well,
will, or,
they're right here.
okay, interest groups, okay.
Yes.
I
Yeah,
don't know,
they're
I seem to think of interest groups more as public and those as more as,
Well, they're part of that.
my reason for raising that was just, what do you see the role of the military-industrial complex in the vacillating fortunes of foreign policy?
President Eisenhower has said something about that back in the 1950s. But definitely they have interest to promote weapons procurement, and not only within the United States, but to sell those weapons outside. I mean, Saudi Arabia, on the average year, buys something like $12 to $15 billion weapons from us. I've been to Saudi several times, and I stayed in Dhahran every time I would go there, about probably 3 miles up from the military base of Dhahran. And there you would see all the latest arrivals of F-18s and F-15s. These are all hard cash. So we bought their oil, and they took our dollars. The dollars recycled themselves, came back and bought F-15s and F-18s, among other things. Yes.
If you were running for president, what would your
I
promise?
can't. I'm a Greek. I was born in Greece. Therefore, I can't.
Just like any
Yeah, you've been deprived of the possibility of voting for me. Okay, one more. Anything else? Yes.
Yes, I have a few comments. One is that I recently read on some declassified documents from the Department of Defense that when they were studying sanctions put against Iraq post-Desert Storm, that the major sanctions they enforced were ones on water cleaning and water purification systems, and that the total analysis of this resulted in knowing that they would be killing and spreading chlamydia, diseases such as diarrhea, chlamydia,
Okay.
E. coli, all these things, killing tons and tons of civilians, and not even affecting the regime, the oppressive regime that we so long supported prior to Desert Storm. And what I'm getting at is, I'm wondering, you said that we needed to be, as citizens of this country, as being concerned citizens, we have to be motivated to be a part of this process. What, in your experience, would you say is the most effective way to help motivate people to action, and to help action, and what actions would be most effective in changing the political establishment so that it becomes an actual principled government based upon our value system that we hold?
Well, join organizations that believe in your ideas, write for the local newspapers, talk to your congressman. After all, you vote for them. There'll be elections coming up now. Go to meetings where they go to talk about their campaigns and what their goals are. Corner them about what exactly do they believe in and why. And don't let them get away with promises. And this is part, I tell you that from my own personal experience, and I hold my own Greek American community responsible for that. They get a lot of promises they don't follow up, so people don't follow up on what they promised, and then in the next election, nobody holds them accountable. Hold them accountable for what they promise. So there are multiple areas where you can act, even though you live in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Support those who believe in the same ideas. Make donations to those who believe in the same ideas. Write, speak about these issues, and ask people to respond at the same level. Don't be ashamed to do that. Well, thank you very much.